Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's great to see people start to filter in. For those of you who don't know me, I am a research and policy analyst here at JENA, the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network Africa. I'm also a Jesuit. I am really thrilled to be here and thrilled to see uh, some familiar names among those of you with us, as well as some new names. We have, I think, what is a really great and wonderful and exciting webinar today. We'll also be recording this for those who are not able to make it. Just a word of introduction before we begin. So I know many of us are actively involved in ecosystem restoration projects already, whether it be tree planting or something similar, something else. And we at JENA received a number of requests starting about 2 years ago to start thinking about not only what are good practices and try to collect good practices for ecosystem restoration, but what it means to do ecosystem restoration from a Catholic, a Christian, and a faith-based perspective. And so what we are presenting to you today is some results of that work over the last couple of years. And we just have some wonderful guests with us from Loyola University Chicago who have been involved in that work to varying degrees. And we will introduce them as they come. While we go, feel free to put questions in the chat. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and we'll also have some brief Q&A after the first presentation. So our first presenter today is Dr. Mike Shook. Mike is on the theology faculty and has a dual appointment to the theology department and the School of Environmental Sciences at Loyola University Chicago. He also has I don't know if this should be embarrassing for you, Mike, but Mike taught me when I was at Loyola Chicago. But we're really glad to have him, and he'll be kind of representing our theological voice before we move on to a second ethical perspective and then some advice on concrete practices for ecosystem restoration. So Mike, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
Take it away.
Great. I'm going to put a PowerPoint up if you don't mind.
Yeah, Esther, can you make Mike a co-host and or make me a host? Awesome, thanks.
Yep. Can everybody see this screen?
Yes, we see you very clearly.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see it.
About a year and a half ago, a group of Roman Catholic nuns out in Aberdeen, South Dakota, contacted me, and they had encountered the Healing Earth textbook, the online environmental science textbook that we have, and they were deciding what to do with some land that they have out in Aberdeen. They were downsizing. They're a smaller group of nuns now. They moved into the city into a smaller apartment, and they moved away from the convent, and they have 24 acres out there that they wanted to be responsible for restoring before either donating it to the city or to the local Native American tribe. And they wanted to restore it in a faith kind of inspired way with reflection that would attend to the actual practices of the restoration. So kind of the soft skills that would accompany the more practical features of what goes into land restoration. In their case, a piece of prairie land that had been rather overgrazed and was in kind of rough shape. We worked with them in the past year and thought that maybe from that experience we could extract some patterns that might be usable for other religious or faith-based institutions that are in the same situation that want to restore some land, but do it mindfully. So we're drafting this handbook. It's not, it's still in a kind of rudimentary draft form. So I'm really looking forward to getting some feedback, whether it's now or later, from people who may be interested in looking through it. I've just made some PowerPoint slides of the key moments in the handbook. It's not the full handbook here in front of us, but so we divided it up into these 5 parts. And let me see if I can get this going. So we're calling it this Integral Ecology and Land Restoration Framework. And we're saying it's a multifaceted assistance and education program designed for faith-based communities and institutions undertaking land restoration projects from an integral ecology perspective. And we're looking at how land restoration can obviously enrich the earth, but also enrich the restorers that are doing the restoration. Integral ecology is really the key to the way we're trying to approach the soft skills, and we're defining that in terms of how integral ecology orients us toward the natural world, with an emphasis on the reciprocal relationships between environment and human society, and also what we're calling a composite awareness of the earth. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. Okay. The reciprocal relationships, you're all familiar with that theme from integral ecology. It's not 2 separate crises, but one crisis. And composite awareness, this is an important element of integral ecology as well. We've kind of groped for words to describe what this is, but it is that the best that I can describe it is if you imagine a good friend that you haven't met for a long time, and you're coming to the coffee shop to meet this friend, and you see them at a distance, and you immediately kind of make a little fact check on, whoa, do they look older? Do they look healthy? And then at the same time, at that simultaneous moment, you're also feeling a kind of a moral care for this person. You care, you have trust, and at the same time, your spirit's being uplifted, and you'll immediately reach out and touch and hug and shake hands. And this is kind of, it all happens simultaneously. It's what we call a kind of a composite awareness of someone that's a friend. And I think that the kind of ecological conversion that Pope Francis is talking about as a part of integral ecology is our capacity to approach nature with that composite awareness, to look at, to approach trees and plants and animals with that kind of simultaneity of care and uplift. It takes practice, and like any spiritual exercise does. But these are the 2 things that we are kind of baking into our land restoration handbook as the practices of land restoration move forward, to stay attentive to elevating our consciousness of reciprocal relationships, and also to keep practicing that composite awareness. So our steps are in the process of a land restoration project: discernment and decision-making, outreach and planning, executing and monitoring. So we walk through each of these steps and make suggestions as to how a community can go about discernment and decision-making over a piece of land that it's considering to restore. And then we, and there's several pages where we go through practical suggestions about that, but kind of moving quickly to the integral ecology piece. What we do with in this first moment of identifying reciprocal relationships is inviting people to really get the community to really get a good history of the land. That is the land's history before any kind of titles were assigned to it, pre-occupation period, and then do a good title search so the land can tell its story, and the land story can be part of the consciousness of people doing the land restoration project. The other thing is to kind of get a handle on the social ecological system, that social environmental connection. And this is one paradigm that's a useful paradigm to use to walk through that. And along with that, you'll see ecosystem services in there. Ecosystem services are just a great paradigm for a community to explore and understand this, the relationship between human well-being and nature to continue to make that integral ecology connection. In terms of encouraging composite awareness in the first step of the handbook, a lot has to do with getting in touch with your senses, your sensorium. How are you reacting to the land physically and emotionally? Registering how you value the land, what meaning the land gives to you, what actions does it seem to be calling for you, and in a way that's kind of following this kind of Ignatian pedagogy paradigm of seeing scientifically, evaluating ethically, reflecting spiritually and acting. Outreach and planning, the second step of really trying to get collaborators and to start planning your restoration project. There's all kinds of materials of a practical nature that we offer in the handbook. But again, getting to the kind of soft skills of embedding this in integral ecology. Here we add another resource, the Planetary Boundaries resource from the Stockholm Resilience Center, which again shows the impact, deleterious impact of human action on the 9 basic planetary systems. It's good for people to be aware of how this land fits into a larger reality. And then in encouraging composite awareness, we introduce a kind of a little bit of an examen here at point 3 to help people to learn that process of registering decimal disintegration activity. For the last step of executing and monitoring, again, we have a lot of resources we offer on execute plan. What become very commonplace in business education when it comes to execution, there's lots of attention now on leadership self-awareness, and key to that is emotional intelligence. And so there's so much literature now that's going on in business education on emotional intelligence. So we thought we would draw on that paradigm in this section and invite, this is an emotions wheel, and how it's used. You start with the inner emotion, and then you go to the outer circle to refine your emotional vocabulary. And I guess research has shown that this helps people to communicate their feelings when they can put a more refined nomenclature on that. So we go through the kind of 4 stages of execution of a project: the beginning, routinization stage, crisis stage, closure stage, which have some kind of predictable emotional valleys, I guess, and encouraging groups to be intentional about meeting, on a regular basis within these stages to talk about emotions, and hopefully knowing that there's a vocabulary there that people can share. There'll be trust, and it can help. And we think that it's, again, another dimension of the kind of the soft skills that you'd need if you were coming at a land restoration project from a faith-based perspective. So in the end, we invite people to kind of look again at the work that we've done in the handbook through the steps, and kind of come away at closure of the project and with hopefully some personal growth and closeness to nature. I'll just conclude with we offer support in the handbook, integral ecology formation. We can work with communities if they want guidance on some of these formation elements. We can, if this works, we can get communities that are doing land restoration projects from a faith perspective to join, to support one another and learn from one another. And like Dr. Tuckman and I, we actually went out to Aberdeen, South Dakota and spent 4 days with the sisters and saw the land, and that was very important. And I think, at least theoretically, we'd want to be able to offer on-site assistance. So if somebody in Kenya wants to do this, I will be happy to come. We've got a toolkit with each of these are hypertexts that have just a lot of resources here on SMART goal, how to use SMART goals, how to do an examen, how to form a committee. There's a lot of resources here. And then finally, just some appendices. We match our resources with our 3 steps to give people an idea of where a resource would apply to the step that they're on. And then we just offer a kind of sample calendar of where things would happen. So I'm really asking if anybody in this community on this webinar is interested, if you could give some feedback. If you're interested in reading it and giving some feedback, we want to know if we feel that if this really addresses an actual need, and maybe things like this already exist that we're not aware of. And does the framework present material in a good way? Are there missing elements? Is it practical or unrealistic? So, that's what we're up to, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share our project.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. That's I think for just my immediate reaction is that that's very interesting, and I think the framework itself certainly is a need. And I'm also noticing that you just mentioned Kenya, and all the Kenyans are in the chat saying, welcome, karibu sana. So be careful. Does anybody, so unfortunately Mike cannot stay for the whole time, but so does anybody have questions for him now? You can either put your questions in the chat, or just feel free to unmute yourself and speak. We're not too many here for that.
I'm good until about 10 to 9, and then I have to go to another meeting.
Great.
10 to 9 Chicago time.
Sister, please.
Hello, sister.
Hello, I'm Sister Benedetta, working with the Association of Sisters of Kenya, with communities and across the 25 dioceses of Kenya. But I want to understand how what you have shared, because I understand in our Lenten campaign, 1 week we had ecological education, but this seems to be a bit more intensive and very more elaborate. How can it be more simplified for the local communities? Thank you.
I would need to, for instance, like work with you or with someone interested to know how to calibrate to different audiences, So this happened to be kind of calibrated to the audience that we just worked with, this Presentation Sisters in South Dakota. But we would have to have have to develop a way to calibrate this presentation to other cultures and other circumstances. So I think it can be done. I think it could be done. I just love to get some feedback and assistance on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I think that sometimes we can get a little glib about integral ecology and kind of imagine that, well, once we read about it, we understand it. But it's something that is that needs to be embedded in our consciousness, and so there needs to be practices that we undergo and material that we read together and discussions that we have. I think it takes time to really appreciate what integral ecology represents.
Great. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, sister, for that question. Are there any other questions for Mike? Aoife? Aoife, did you have a question? Okay, maybe he can't hear.
Do you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can. Yes, Aoife, we can hear you. It looks like through the other device. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and ask it.
Patricia, yan bisa? Sa Andresa mo. Hi. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody from Madagascar. I am Aoife from Central Madagascar, in charge of the program Environment and Sustainable Development. Thank you very much, Mike, for this very important presentation. Central Madagascar is not engaged in land restoration, and thank you for this presentation because I learned so much things. But I have a global question, just one question. I am still I don't really understand the difference between integral ecology and ecological conversion. Are that two things very different, or the ecological conversion is something under the integral ecology? Because currently we are preparing a training on Laudato Si animators, which will take place in the south of Madagascar in a few weeks. And in order to be well prepared, we have to master many things on integral ecology and Laudato Si. Thank you.
There are two central themes in Laudato Si that tell us something about integral ecology. And one is that he repeats how everything is connected between and God. So we need part of ecology. The second theme that Pope Francis repeats is the necessity that we have an ecological conversion. this is also a dimension of integral ecology. It takes an inner conversion to come to love the earth if we're not loving it at this moment. And it version our the between the social and the environmental. So I don't think there's any way you can separate those two ideas, the ecological conversion and the connection of everything that are integral. In my interpretation of Laudato Si.
Great. Eva, are you satisfied with that answer? Awesome. I think we can squeeze in one more quick question for Mike, if there is anybody out there who still has one. Thanks for that. That you've experienced between conversion and implementation. That's certainly something that I've experienced, kind of charging ahead and then realizing along the way that maybe there is a more integral ecology way of doing something. In my own experience, integral ecology is not just something you achieve, it's something that you have to live into over time. And it's iterative. We have to try again and again.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike, do you have a comment on that tension maybe?
I think that one of the reasons that Pope Francis is directing our attention is traditional indigeneity is an integral understanding of our relationship to the earth. That frankly, most of us in Western civilization have lost. And it's not easy to regain because our attentions are more occupied by consumerism, by the objectification of nature. These forces are over. France to really take a gift that this people can offer in really integral, a more integral way of understanding our relationship to nature. When I was at protest, one of the elders came on up to every evening an elder spoke around the big fire, and we were there because and was threatening their water source, and we were protesting to have the pipeline stopped. And the elder said, "We are not here to protect water." And we all thought, well, of course that's why we're here. We're here to stop this pipeline. But the elder said, "We are not here to protect water. We are water protecting itself. We are water. And we're here for our brother water." It reminded me so much of St. Francis of Assisi and back to Pope Francis and this deep connection.
Well, thanks for that, Mike. That's a really wonderful story. Sure, Matthews. I think we can do one more question before we move on.
Okay. Thank you so much. for the good presentation, Mike.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm from Jesuit Center for Ecology and Development. And as JCD, we're excited with the handbook. Yeah, we have had some experience in implementing the activities related to integral ecology. And here in Malawi, I would say that we're one of the organizations who are really trying to push that to the people. One key thing that I wanted to just to comment on, I don't have a question, it's just a comment, is that integral ecology requires more skills on contextualizing the principles when we're working with the people, with the farmers. We need to contextualize because it's not the same, in all areas.
Yeah.
So as you had mentioned that when sister asked, is it possible to simplify it to farmers? What is important is to have the skills of integrating the activities, because they are not new activities, or we can't take the handbook direct the way it is and then implement it on the ground. We need to understand the culture and the restoration activities which are there, and be able to connect that the way the people understand their environment, the way they do their restoration activities, so that they can deepen that connection. That it's not a matter of just doing the activities to restore the environment, but something in us pushing that we really have to do this thing. We work with farmers, so we usually do some ecological examine, which do not flow in the way they are written, but we find a way of contextualizing in their environment, in their community, so that they should be able to practice something that they would take that it is part of them, not something new coming from somewhere. And I've seen people being moved, connecting themselves to what they have already been doing, but now with a different understanding and a different love to the work of restoration. Yeah. So what we need is to have those skills, and then we can consult, like from Mike, how to use it, and then when we're going on to the ground, it's our work now to connect whatever we have to the people. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to comment.
Yeah.
During the Laudato Si week, JCD will be doing a number of activities on this. We'll be able to share, and please check what we'll be doing. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Matthews. Mike, do you have any kind of comment to that, or do you feel ready to move on?
It puts me in mind of my own students who, when I will begin to speak about environmental spirituality, they look at it as something outside themselves. They associate it with religion, and they generally don't want to have anything to do with religion. So it's outside themselves. But by careful work, they can discover it in themselves. If you can help students start where they are at and identify their own spiritualities, now I think in comparison with Matthew, putting it in the context of where the students are and building from their strengths, and then they can grow in more diverse understandings of their own spirituality. And I think it works that way personally and also culturally.
Well, thank you. And thanks for those comments. We're getting some more things in the chat, which I encourage everybody to take a look at. But at this point, we're going to move on, and we'll hear from Lillian, and then we'll hear from Brian, and then we will have more Q&A after that. So Lillian, please, I will put your presentation up, but feel free to begin speaking whenever you like.
Sure. Well, good evening, everybody. It's good morning for some of us here in Chicago. But my name is Lillian. I am a PhD student here at Loyola University in Chicago. I have lived most of my life in India, and I am currently in the United States pursuing my graduate studies in philosophy. I am grateful to Brian for inviting me to share some of the research that we did a few months ago on the ethical aspects of ecosystem restoration. Thank you to Professor Mike for a wonderful presentation on integral ecology. I won't be touching as much on that, and so I'm glad that was shared first. I'm sure many of you here are already familiar in some way, practically or theoretically, with ecosystem restoration. My presentation will be a little bit on the theoretical side, so I hope that you will bear with me. I will outline ecosystem restoration first. I will note the various problems that have arisen from pursuing ecosystem restoration without appropriate concern for the ethical aspects of the same. I will then recent and maybe one not so recent papers that insist that we pay attention to the ethics of ecosystem restoration and the way that this work connects all of us. This also involves understanding the responsibilities that we have towards one another, especially in ensuring that past injustices are not repeated. I will conclude with some suggestions from these scholars about how we ought to think when planning ecosystem restoration projects. So what ecosystem restoration, broadly speaking, is the process by which human beings assist the recovery of an impaired tract of nature. Our ecosystems have been and continue to be degraded, damaged, and destroyed in various ways. Degradation refers to long-term, non-severe human disturbance. Examples of degradation include deforestation, overgrazing, or selected extermination of particular species. Damage refers to acute or severe human impact or disturbance that alters or transforms an area. Think of building projects or the impact of war on the land. Destruction refers to when all or most organic matter is removed from an area. So the restoration of ecosystems, also sometimes called ecological restoration, might involve acts of revegetation, reintroduction of species, and assisted colonization or migration. This is in direct response to such degradation, damage, or destruction. Ecosystem restoration fundamentally acknowledges at its core that something went wrong. There is a moral duty associated with this human attempt to correct mistakes of the past. One author refers to this as reparative justice and environmental moral repair. Perhaps it is clear from just this short description that there are ethical aspects to ecosystem restoration that cannot go ignored. The United Nations has declared 2021 to 2030 as the decade on ecosystem restoration. There have been devastating human consequences of ecosystem degradation, damage, and destruction. Authors note that declines in human health are increasingly being linked to associated decline in biodiversity, as well as the quality and quantity of ecosystem resources. The current global context seems to point towards increasing ecocide. Reports from 2019 have indicated that we would see about 1 million species of plants and animals go extinct. The year 2019 was also the second warmest year on Earth since 1850. Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day that humanity is using up natural resources 1.75 times as fast as ecosystems can regenerate those resources. In 2019, that was on the 29th of July. Countries have been falling short in their attempts to tackle climate change at the national level. Humans have both had a hand in and been impacted by climate change, mass extinction, and food and water shortages. natural disasters are also linked with how we have abused our ecosystems. So ecosystem preservation and restoration have been underway for decades at this point. However, the capitalism-motivated, market-based, individual action-focused, and top-down approach is inadequate. In some cases, we have even proceeded without adequate knowledge of particular ecosystems, with incomplete, ahistorical, selective, and misleading data. Authors Bliss and Fisher provide case studies from Western Africa and Northwestern America of how colonial attitudes ensured inappropriate ecosystem restoration strategies. These colonial attitudes rejected traditional ecological knowledge that indigenous inhabitants of the area have maintained and transmitted safely across generations. Such arrogance has led to strategies that focused more on control and economic success than the health of the ecosystems under consideration. There have also been two kinds of excesses in ecosystem restoration strategy. Too much of a top-down approach that is heavy-handed governmental intervention, and too much also of a hands-off local approach without adequate support. There must be a balance between the two in order to honor local responsibility and stakeholders, providing them with access to larger resources from the national or transnational context when it's necessary. Ecosystem restoration is not a race between communities, but a collective project that we all share in. The literature warns us against setting either too ambitious a goal that will never be achieved, as well as against setting too limited a goal that only a particular community achieves. Both of those strategies reflect a disingenuity at the level of strategic planning. An appropriately sensitive ecosystem restoration strategy would be sensitive to shifting local conditions, as our dear friend just mentioned, dynamic enough to switch its approaches based on these changes, and technically skilled enough to do both. So what does the literature in ethics of ecosystem restoration propose? I've put up some of the references on the screen in case you want to follow up on some of these papers. The literature we focused on in our research has less to do with abstract philosophical theories of right and wrong, and more to do with concrete social and political impacts of ecosystem restoration. This is not a problem, since justice is a matter of concrete circumstances, and it is meaningless if it is not applicable to social and political situations. Marlene Elias, Deepa Joshi, and Ruth Meinzendick, in their 2021 article, Restoration for Whom by Whom, stress on our need to understand how existing injustices affect ecosystem restoration. They point out that global level diplomatic agendas and multinational corporations' economic interests do shape smaller scale local initiatives towards ecosystem restoration. This has certainly been true of certain green development strategies. Further, the excessive weight given to the natural sciences in ecosystem restoration work has also meant that the social sciences have been neglected in informing such strategic planning. The authors observe that this has led to exclusionary ideas of what sustainability is, and ecosystem health has been reduced to merely biophysical health. They insist that human-nature relationships are complex and should not be simplified to suit the interests of those who will not have to directly experience the consequences of insincere restoration practices. Since social and political processes such as colonization and capitalist greed have been involved in creating and sustaining ecological crises, they must be addressed in their local forms when attempting to plan ecosystem restoration. The authors ask us to be mindful of which natural state we're trying to return an area to, and also of whether plural, unequal local voices and knowledge systems are being valued. Andrew Light, decades earlier in 1994, wrote an article called Hegemony and Democracy: How Politics in Restoration Informs the Politics of Restoration. In this article, Light addressed similar concerns, bringing in the ethical aspects of ecosystem restoration. He calls ecosystem restoration a reaction to the then preservationist environmentalism, which itself had explicit political dimensions because it involved making a collective decision about what would ecosystem. Similarly, Light says what to restore and what perhaps not to restore. These choices have ethical effects to them because of the political governance of nature. Some of us might be familiar with this attitude through the anthropocentric doctrine. This prevailing perspective involves a political concept of sovereignty and ushers us towards understanding a more symbiotic relation between humans and nature. Pope Francis, in his Laudato Si encyclical, refers to perhaps understanding ourselves as stewards rather than masters of our ecosystems. Given this prevailing perspective, we cannot be uncomfortable with thinking through the political dimensions of ecosystem restoration, since that would also lead to ineffective planning. Political motivations guide many groups, bodies, and from our projects, but especially they have resources that shape what the strategy will be and who will make decisions at the local level. For example, perfect ecosystem restoration performed using slave labor, says Light, will not be acceptable ethically. Going back to Elias and the other authors of that paper, they observe that ecosystem restoration has both, at the same time, great transformative demarcate, for instance, those of marginalized communities who already access, use, and maintain that land are barred from it. They give an illustrative example from Gambia, where external donors in environmental to their supporting of agro projects by men on land that women had already been using for cultivation. Thus, these existing power asymmetries in terms of gender, class, cost, etc., can complicate ecosystem restoration efforts because of their relation to legal land rights. They're suspicious of whether powerful capitalist interests that got us into these crises in the first place are motivated or even able to provide adequate solutions to restoration efforts. Such interests are fundamentally exclusive and undemocratic, talking about the capitalist interests. The authors remind us that these power relations intersect with one another as well, requiring careful analysis and not rushing towards simplistic solutions. They affirm that we will need a diverse set of agents who can adequately tell the story, form a narrative around the ecological crises that are different from place to place, leading to a holistic and context-sensitive plan of action. Elias et al. Also remind us that some of these plans will involve addressing historical injustices done to indigenous communities who have had inextricable relationships with their land and natural environment. Robin Kimmerer's 2011 article titled Restoration and Reciprocity, The Contributions of Traditional Ecological Knowledge, addresses this particular angle in great detail, stating that the idea of reciprocity with land is fundamental to many indigenous belief systems. She argues and develops the idea of reciprocal restoration, which is a mutually reinforcing restoration of land and culture, such that the repair of ecosystem services contributes to cultural revitalization, and this revitalization or renewal of culture promotes restoration of ecological integrity. Reciprocal restoration recognizes that it is not just the land that's broken, but our relationship to it. Traditional ecological knowledge, she observes, is highly rational, empirical, and pragmatic, while simultaneously integrating cultural values and moral perspectives. With its worldview of respect, responsibility, and reciprocity with nature, traditional ecological knowledge does not compete with science, nor detract from science's power, but extends its scope into additional human interactions with the natural world. The ability of indigenous peoples to exercise their stewardship roles with the land is central to the principle of reciprocal restoration. It's also tied intimately with legal title to the land. A focus on restoration of the relationship guided by traditional ecological knowledge moves us away from the anthropocentric relationship to land into the realm of kin-centric relationships to the land, in which our moral responsibility extends to all of our non-human relatives. Non-human species are the prime beneficiaries of the restoration. what conservationists call biodiversity, traditional peoples call kin. Kimmerer also asserts that such restoration is is understood as directed by nature. Practitioners adaptively change the plan as the land responds to treatments. The stated goal of the restoration is to help a site evolve through cyclical changes rather than establishing a linear trajectory. I will close by drawing out a few practical insights from a 2020 paper titled A World of Possibilities, 6 Restoration Strategies to Support the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. The authors recommend a holistic and integrative community-oriented approach, which is sensitive to Indigenous history and injustices. This would be eco-cultural restoration. The authors suggest investing in interdisciplinary work, given that the kinds of problems the ecological crises raise are complex and require large systems approaches. They advise us to significantly increase on-site training and capacity building opportunities for local stakeholders from a variety of fields, from education and science to religion and administration. This will adequately mobilize local traditional knowledge and build a community of skilled and invested ecosystem restorers. They advocate the studying and communication of the intricate linkages between restoring ecosystem health and the improvement of physical, mental, social, and spiritual health of local and global human populations, along with the general well-being and sustainability of communities, nations, and society. I hope that through this presentation, I've been able to successfully direct our attention towards the ethical aspects of ecosystem restoration. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Lillian. That was really wonderful. And I know I forgot to say this. Maybe you said this, but just so everybody knows, Lillian is a PhD student in the philosophy department at Loyola Chicago. So we're going to move now to Dr. Brian Osowski. Brian is also a professor at Loyola. We're sensing a theme here about where we're sourcing our speakers. Brian is a restoration ecologist, and I will let him take it from there.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, evening. I'm in Chicago. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent.
Yes.
Great. I do have some sun in my eyes. So in Chicago, we haven't had sun in a while, so I'm enjoying it while we have it here. So, so I'm happy to join you today. I will share my screen if I'm allowed to share my screen here. Let me take a look. Okay. Excellent. And let me hide the floating panel here. I will do this. Everyone can see me okay, hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yes, so this has been a really wonderful presentation that we've had from Leanne and Mike, and it ties really well into the work that I do and the presentation that I'm going to give you today. Just a little bit of background on me. I'm a restoration ecologist that teaches and does research at Loyola University Chicago in the School of Environmental Sustainability. I'm an untraditional professor. I'm coming from a very working class background, growing up in the Great Lakes region in the middle part of the United States. And I'm really, finding my way to connect with nature and to connect with human communities, as well as to help to promote biodiversity and reconnect some of the severed relationships that we have with the land. I think it's really important that we all connect to all of the concepts and philosophies that have been mentioned by Mike and Lillian as well. So I think that those conversations are quite important as we go through some of the scientific foundations and some of the Western science practices that we're going to talk about today. So as Lillian had mentioned, the definition of ecological restoration is quite a 10,000 foot view. It is also purposefully vague in a lot of ways because depending where you're at on the planet, depending what ecosystem you're working with, depending with the traditional ecological knowledge and local land knowledge that we have, it has to be vague because there is no one size fits all philosophy to working with this practice of ecological restoration. As defined by the Society for Ecological Restoration International in 2004, it is a process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been damaged, degraded, or destroyed. But there are many different scenarios, many different approaches. How was this ecosystem destroyed? Was it destroyed by mining or large-scale industrial pollution and processes? Was it deforestation? Was it overgrazing? All of these approaches are really important as we connect to the cause of and potential solution to taking a best adaptive management footstep forward. So as we are thinking about the philosophy of ecological restoration, it is something that we are trying to improve the habitat quality for organisms that would be existing in the previously impacted ecosystem, but also, again, to elevate the human culture of the people that are connected to these landscapes. Just from a Western scientific philosophy and practice, ecological restoration is extremely new within the realm of scientific inquiry from a Western perspective. This is a Society for Ecological Restoration, was established in 1988. I was personally born in 1977, so in my lifetime, this has been an official society of which people have connected to. And I love to see this science and practice grow. When I was first looking for graduate school work, I could not find a discipline that actually had the tag of a degree of ecological restoration at a graduate level. Now we are seeing programs all over the world. We are seeing undergraduate majors in ecological restoration. Our young people across the world realize we have massive problems of biodiversity loss. We have massive issues of climate change that is imminent and real as we are trying to address these large also landscape conversion and also consumer capitalism. And I think our young people are responding quite well, leading to the growth and development of this field. To me, one of the largest victories in this international conversation has been the UN declaring this currently the decade of ecosystem restoration to massively scale up the restoration of degraded landscapes and to help to fight climate crisis, enhance food security, enhance water supply for local people, and also, without forgetting, to improve biodiversity because we are in currently the 6th mass extinction basically based on a scientific record and inquiry. I pulled a quote from this document, and Brian will share these documents with you. These sources are going to be linkable, and you should be able to download these documents that I've been discussing. But ecosystem restoration is a fundamental to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, mainly those on climate change, poverty eradication, food security, water, and biodiversity conservation. So one of the biggest challenges that we currently have, as was astutely pointed out by Mike and Lillian, is we're often working kind of blind because ecosystems are complex. We have a countdown clock of these losses of biodiversity and climate change, and we need to be proactive, not just reactive, but we're also stepping oftentimes into a world of unknowns. There is a history, as was mentioned, of a lot of mistakes that were made in ecological restoration, and we will continue to make mistakes. And I think that we as practitioners and scientists and local communities have to be ready and to react to something that might not be perfect, but we need to take a holistic approach with the best knowledge to integrate all forms of knowledge to be able to take this next step. Because the next step is scale and scaling up of ecological restoration. The world is now spending billions of dollars, and this is something even 20 years ago that would have been unheard of in this field. Over 80 countries have committed to restoration of 30 million hectares of degraded landscapes. And we must be proactive and prudent, but also thoughtful about how we approach this, because there is not a one-size-fits-all philosophy. As was mentioned, there can be selective species selections and also biases from individuals to be able to restore these areas. So we must have a community conversation as well as a restoration practice that is based in sound knowledge and scientific inquiry. Because when we think about large scale management, we're thinking about conservation, we're thinking about management and restoration, social systems and economics, because all of these are going to be integratively tied, because there are many stakeholders and people who have very direct, deep ties and land ethical responsibility to our landscapes. So as was mentioned by Liliane, actually, Dr. Aronson is one of the foremost thinkers in this field of restoration, pretty transformational in his approaches. And from a few of his papers, I pulled a few quotes, is that scaling up is one of the most foremost challenges in the science, practice, and policy of ecological restoration. And existing restoration models have merit, but are insufficient and meaningfully scaled up in today's world. I botched that sentence, sorry about that. But this is very true, that scaling up is going to be one of our largest challenges, because we are often crossing over to thinking about multiple areas within a watershed or a landscape that is going to be heterogeneous with many different stakeholder opinions. And so we must be stewards of conversation as we move forward. One of the other big challenges that we have that I think about often is this concept of shifting or sliding baselines. This concept was coined by Dr. Pauly at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, but we are human beings with selective biases. Our biases are real. We cannot ignore them. We should try to acknowledge them as much as we possibly can. But these are where we have a reference point that is from each individual's reference point. And we have a very hard time as human beings to think about or to have the experiences of someone 100, 1,000, or 10,000 years ago. It is impossible for us to be able to take that approach. And so we have these selective biases of the way that it is now, and people have become very rigid in their thought spaces. Sorry, I have a cat that is mad. But this is just a picture of the expectation of fishermen off the coast of Florida in the United States, where we are looking at world fishing records of what people expect to see for a catch of the day. We are seeing smaller, we are seeing less biomass when we turn in terms of catch from even the 1950s through the 2000s. And those expectations are what each of these individual fishermen are experiencing, and it has shifted over time. But it is really hard to go back in thought from now in 2023 to have the same expectations in the 1950s. But we have these inherent biases, which are very, very hard to overcome. And there are many, many, many examples of how we experience forests or grasslands or wetlands in modern society and connecting that back to the past. So as Liliane mentioned, and I think this is very important, that this is not just a scientific practice, even though many Western scientists have historically ignored natural capital, ecosystem services, and socioeconomic issues. I think that the conversations of integrating these approaches to ecosystem services, indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and local knowledge is shifting tremendously in a positive direction, but we have a very long way to go. But we as restoration practitioners and academics need to understand the constraints that we have to our socioeconomic systems. This disconnect must be mended by philosophers and religious leaders and academics and practitioners when we think about the holistic approach to ecological restoration. So as was mentioned, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, is that there's many different approaches to ecological restoration. This is not a binary approach. There is not a approach to say we are doing restoration or not. It is a gradient. It is a philosophy of which we can do many different activities as we move forward. But this is also really important as we look at the impact that is currently happening at the landscape, the stakeholders that we have, and best management practices. So just briefly reiterating some of the concepts that were mentioned already, we have many approaches that we can take. We can look at environmental remediation, which is probably the most simplistic form, even though the practices are very complex, where we have an acute problem. We have some degradation, some pollution, some mining activity. This is a photo from the remediation of forest around residential areas, farm and public spaces after the Fukushima meltdown in the Fukushima prefecture, after we had the tsunami that hit Japan. And this is literally scraping and removing contaminated soils and removing them from the area without the philosophy of a holistic approach necessarily of biodiversity and human society integration. Sorry, I have a cat. I'm gonna have to hold this cat. Okay, all right, yes, I know, okay. Okay, sorry about that. And then we have this approach to environmental recuperation. The recuperation is the recovery of degraded lands by all means possible to bring back some productive condition. We can think about this as sustainable agriculture, reforestation, or dam removal. Oftentimes we're more simplistic in our goals with environmental recuperation. We often will just take one philosophical approach of removing a dam, for example, or replanting trees or seeding. And I think that these things are really effective and they become a step up from environmental remediation, but it is also something that is going to have to be philosophically, I would argue, more holistic, to take a more holistic approach to take many more aspects of a project on. So this is a graph from a paper that I have recently read by Dr. Aronson that is looking at the gradient of which we are going to approach from environmental remediation through to ecological restoration. Environmental remediation is a baseline of addressing one of those pollutant problems. Reparation and communication is a partial recovery. And then we can look at this full, more holistic approach to look at soils, plants, animals, insects, hydrology, soil nutrients, and those kind of approaches, which would lead more towards a philosophy of a holistic ecological restoration. So this is a continuum, and I think that as we move forward, that we're having this conversation, it is extremely valuable and important, because as we think about where our role is in terms of project management, working with communities, working with our farmers, working with urban environments and park systems, working with larger NGO, non-governmental organizations and other entities that are doing ecological restoration, all conversation in this restoration continuum is going to be really important. I think ideally, as we become more sophisticated in our approaches, we do want to take a ecological restoration approach to address all aspects of an ecosystem, to be able to bring in that social and cultural restoration, as well as the approaches that we are going to be integrating with our actual restoration approaches. So one of the things I did want to kind of briefly touch as we're going to be looking at these international standards, I've shared with Brian a document which has been put together by the Society for Ecological Restoration. It is now its second edition. I encourage him to widely share this presentation and that document. And it really is an approach that is going to be much more sophisticated from 20 years ago to think about international standards. Again, there is no one cookie cutter, one size fits all solution. But if we take an approach of integrating culture, integrating economics, integrating stakeholders, and also the science and practice of traditional ecological knowledge, local knowledge, and also Western and scientific approaches, I think we will be able to continue with the conversation that is going to be very important as we learn and grow and move forward. So the international standards document is really important in terms of trying to look at the state of affairs now and see where we can make improvements. For those that are out there, the Society for Ecological Restoration is, if anybody wants to be involved in these projects, is always looking for contributions as well as language translations. And they have specific calls to translate into languages that would be appropriate for your community. Just wanted to say that that's really important as we move forward. With these international standards, we have to also be comfortable with imperfection. Ecological restoration projects often fall short of full recovery, whatever that philosophical endpoint might be. Many projects lack appropriate vision, planning, and implementation. We need to have some kind of baseline outline of what we are doing, and to be able to be adaptive and be comfortable with being wrong sometimes. But I think this is a really important part of our approach, is that we must be thinking about aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems and how biodiversity plays a role here. So one thing I would like to always say, and I mention this in my classes all the time, ecological restoration does not justify the destruction of ecosystems. This is not, oh, if we can rebuild it, then why don't we destroy it and then rebuild it? And I would argue, and I think most ecologists and philosophers and ethicists would also argue, that is a very poor tactic as we are looking at the value of ecological restoration. There is going to be a lot of knowledge that we would lose through the destruction of ecological systems that are intact. And just because we have promise, it does not actually replace the importance of preservation and cultural heritage that is going to be associated with these landscapes. So in this document, I'm just going to briefly touch on this because I do not want to go over time here, is that we have these different approaches to thinking about the principles that underpin ecological restoration. And this is going to be thinking about engaging stakeholders, drawing on many types of different knowledge, informing native reference ecosystem, and trying to be conscientious and careful in terms of considering environmental change, to think about supporting recovery of processes, to have clear goals and objectives, to think about the highest level of recovery possible, and to think about then cumulative gain and being part of a continuum of which I've mentioned. I did want to leave time for any questions that you may have. or any clarifications I can give. I think I've kind of hit all of the major tenets of what I was interested in speaking with you. But again, I think I really appreciate your time here to have this conversation internationally. From a young person back in 2004, I would have been glowing with joy, as I am now, that I can speak to you over this magical box called the internet and Zoom, to people in Africa that are really concerned about this field of ecological restoration and how they can be a part of these solutions, and not necessarily the impacts and continuing business as usual. So with that, Brian, I will turn it over to you. I will stop sharing my screen. But I just wanted to say thank you for your time and attention. Sorry for my meowing cat. She is 18 years old and always cranky. So with that, I leave it to you, Brian.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And thanks to both of you, Brian and Lillian. Those are really wonderful presentations. And even though you're coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds, it's clear to me that there's a lot of common ground that you're kind of pushing us to think about especially as we think about moving forward from a practical perspective. So I'd like to move into some opportunity for some questions right now. And I think Obiora has a question, so I think we'll go to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. I so much cherish what you just said. It's in line with what I've been pushing for the past 10 years. It's one of the articles I wrote concerning ecological restoration, and part of my master dissertation is based on that. And I agree with you totally. There's no single bullet, silver bullet, that solves all the problems. It has to be adapted based on people's cultures, what is obtainable at a particular locale in the world. What works in the Amazon can't work in some part of Africa, So, but my struggle all these years has been the issue of technology and ecological restoration. You see, and the world is progressing. In this part of the world, the idea is that we are not moving forward because we are technologically backward. And so the idea is to engage more in a way of research, refining what we have. And that doesn't help the environment. So the more we want to, adopt the Western mentality of developing and advancing in technology, the more we find ourselves still couching by this ecological destruction of the environment. So it becomes, just going around things as well as we are messing up our environment. So I don't know how long we are going to keep with this, in the sense that this part of the world is trying to catch up. Meanwhile, you can say they still have a reservoir of undestructed, undamaged environment, trying to catch up with the Western in terms of the technological advancement. Meanwhile, they are trying to also reverse what is already damaged. So you see as if, it's a shift from the other part of the world to this part of the world. I totally agree with you. Now you've said, and it's in line with what I've actually written 5-10 years ago. So I don't know how we're going to get out of this hook. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's extremely astute and challenging, and being in a technological world that is, I think, generally highly destructive. There are definitely advantages to technology, but there's also a lot of destructive approaches as well. And people, I think, often see technology as the massive solution. And for me, most of my work would be, as you say, it would be considered regressive. I do just a lot of harvesting of invasive species and trying to use low unsophisticated technological solutions to be able to implement restoration at a large scale. And I think that like drive to be like, oh, we must always do bigger and better and stronger and faster, I think is something that we are going to be pushing against as a philosophy. But I even see it in my young people. In my classes, there is a pushback against a lot of these technological solutions, because technocratic solutions can help, and I use them, believe me, all the time. We're using a technological solution right now to have this conversation. So it's not all doom and gloom, but it's also going back in farming practices that are more traditional are going to be what will save the world, in my opinion. Thinking about polycultures, thinking about biodiversity buffers, you can reduce pesticides, you can reduce herbicides, you can reduce nutrient needs. It's not just rip it, cut it, plant it with genetically modified organisms, throw a bunch of poison on it and get a bunch of food. It has to be a shift in value and philosophy. So I really appreciate that astute response. I don't have an answer for you. I wish I did, but I just wanted to iterate that I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Thank you.
Perhaps I
Yeah,
can
Lillian,
make a
please.
response as well, because this semester I'm currently working on exactly that, about global knowledge inequality, about this distinction between what comes from the West and then everybody is left catching up or like struggling to catch up. And I think something to note, exactly as we've been saying about ecosystem restoration having been influenced by this sort of Western academic sort of framework, capitalist framework, that applies in technology as well. We need more voices influencing how we do technology, how, not just in how it's applied, but how it's developed or where it's developed. Our Zoom servers, where are they in the world? Are there different ways of doing battery technology that isn't terrible for mining and so on and so forth? And so there's that conversation, I think, that will perhaps, like it's happened for ecosystems, it's part of that perhaps. There's lots of other legal issues at the international level that will have to be addressed for things like, yeah, agriculture to flourish.
Thank you, Lillian.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Lillian and Brian and Obiora, for that question. We are coming to time, but I'm wondering, Lillian and Brian, are either or both of you available to take questions for a few more minutes? Awesome, that's great. So Chimwemwe,
Brian,
oh,
I just woke up, so I'm good. I got up an hour and a half ago, 2 hours ago. So, but yeah, I could take questions for another 15 or 20 minutes if people are interested. I'm happy to continue the conversation. And as I mentioned, feel free to reach out to me by email. I can put this in the chat, and I'm happy to have any conversations. I did mention to Brian as well, I do teach this for a living. I have a full semester of these classes. I'd be happy to share some of my lecture materials with the group. I will just warn you ahead of time. It is Michigan, Great Lakes, North American centric. Not just because those are the students that I teach, but I think that the philosophies do hold true around the world. But I'm happy to share some of that for some time as well, because I'm not in it for the degree. I'm in it to help promote and better the world. So.
awesome, thank you. So I think Chimwemwe had a question.
Yes, Brian, thank you so much. Actually, what I wanted to ask has already been asked by Chukunoso. It was more on the use of technology vis-a-vis restoration initiatives. So I think that has been taken up, but just also to agree that I think a lot of research has been done, and we see a lot just quite a lot, and we are doing a lot, including the organizations in Africa. But issues, I don't know where it's coming in the ecological restoration system.
Oh, I think we lost her.
Yeah, okay. Well, hopefully she's able to reconnect. Yeah, Afa, I see you have your hand up.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much, Brian and Lillian, for this very interesting presentation. I have learned a lot from you. I would like, maybe it's not really a question, but a remark, because regarding the case of Madagascar, our real problem is that how to build a kind of a bridge between science and the community. So in Madagascar, we have a lot of scientists, we have a lot of researchers, and it seems that we have the solution for the ecological restoration. But how to apply the solution? This is always the problem. We have a lot of scientific reports published, especially at the university, but there is no action to implement them. Maybe one of the problems is the lack of means, the lack of money, because we are really dependent on financial means and on the collaboration with foreigners. In Madagascar, the budget of the scientific research is under 1% of the government budget. It is maybe 0.0014%. It is almost neglected by the government, so we don't have much money to make research first, and there is no bridge between the research and where we should implement the research result. This is one of the problems. And the second one is when we talk about ecological restoration, one of the most things that we see in Madagascar is the deforestation through agriculture. And we all know that when we make deforestation through fires, so the land will be little by little destroyed, and the farmers have to move from lands to lands to lands to lands, and they also move from protected areas to destroy another protected areas, to make deforestation in another protected areas, forests from forests from forests. And we all see that problem, and we don't have a specific solution because the government maybe doesn't have solution. NGOs and civil societies and international organizations don't have a solution. Why? Because there is no alternative that we can give to the farmers. We don't have alternative. We don't have much job opportunities. We can't give them jobs. So, so what can we do? some international organizations finance or fund some NGOs and civil societies in order to make ecological restoration. But we all see that that is not enough, because according to the Global Forest Watch, 520,000 hectares of forests are lost every year in Madagascar. And if that continues, Madagascar will lose all of forest in only 10 years. In only 10 years. So if we stay and only watch the happening things, and we don't take our decision to do something, our son and daughters will not see forest in 10 years. No lemurs, no water sources. So that is the case of Madagascar currently, and we are stuck in this problem because it seems like we have a lot of research results, but we do not implement the research on the ground. One thing that we at Central Rift Madagascar do is to publish scientific research results on our journals. We have 2 journals. The first one is a quarterly journal, and the second one is a scientific journal. And we published them free in order to make a kind of sensitization or advocacy to target political decision makers and to implement something. And this is our case currently, and we are scared. We are fear, and we are almost lost because sensitization is not enough. We have to implement something specific to save our ecology in Madagascar. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Right.
Hold on,
Yeah.
Brian, 1 second. Thank you so much, Epa. We are kind of running short on time, so I want to also draw your attention, Brian and Lillian, to the question we had in the chat earlier from Senrita Raksam Marak. I'll paste it again just now to bring it back up, and then feel free, both of you, to reply to either question, the one from the ones from Ava or the new one. And I think we'll do these last 2 and then call it. So the floor is open. Brian and Lillian, please welcome.
Oh yeah, just to speak to you, Ava, in the state of affairs in Madagascar, I fully have a swollen heart of empathy for the problems that you're facing right now, and the capitalistic gains of the quick dollar are real. People need to feed their families. People need to have livings that are going to be supporting livelihoods. And I think, and as another, I had a personal message that was asked, destruction is happening faster than restoration. To both of those points, I don't have a solution for you. My biggest solution is connecting to young people, education, communities. I think you hit on a very good point, is that you have these researchers that show up and then leave. You need, I would say, liaisons of local community leaders and people who have influence to be able to have those, to show value and to break that shell of communication, to be that translator. we are in a full-on global crisis of ecological loss and biodiversity loss, and that's not understating it. And I think proactivity and action amongst our youth and amongst our community leaders has to be real and global. And I think we're seeing these losses. It's evident across the world. Like I said, this field is growing tremendously quickly. And the fact that we're having this conversation would have been unheard of to me even 10 years ago. But that does not belay the real quick action that needs to happen on the ground for a community. And I battle the same things in the United States. I email my politicians all the time. I am a loud, squeaky wheel that tries to talk to local, state, and federal people that might have influence. And I battle every single day. If you're in this field to rest on your laurels and to be complacent, it's not really a great field, because I have been fighting for 25 years. It has aged me tremendously, but I still fight every single day to try to make the world a better place through education and practice. I wish I had a better answer for you, but it's going to be a hard uphill battle. But I can only encourage you and inspire you to not stop and to be a loud, squeaky wheel. I support you. And if I can do anything to help, please let me know. I have that dumb little title in front of my name called doctor. People tend to listen to that more for some ridiculous reason, but whatever, I will wield my power as see fit. So if you need, any of you need help or assistance in any capacity I possibly can, I will be happy to throw my academic weight around. But honestly, I'm here to help ecosystems and cultures that are not mindlessly driving to destroy our planet.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Brian has said so far. I wanted to talk about that first part of your question, Eva, about science, that mismatch in what's produced academically and the practice of it. I think Brian was right when he was talking about the need to educate, especially younger folks. And maybe just an anecdote, perhaps. I come from India, and at some point, I think the government instituted this thing that at every year of schooling from, I think, grade 3, class 3 onwards, there would be some component of environmental science or education in the curriculum. And I think that helped a lot of us my age. I'm 25 right now. A lot of us from that age onwards were a lot more sensitive to to having that research translated down into things that we understood, and then could go home and tell our parents, turn the lights off, or let's use less water in this area because we're having a drought situation with our groundwater right now, something like that. So that's the formal, perhaps, anecdote, because it really becomes about bridging like science communication, how the community members who go and read those, I'm glad the articles are freely available, and then translate them at home or translate them at the community table and stuff like that. I think your second question matched with, I think they are not here anymore, Senrita's question about jhum cultivation. It's also a slash and burn technique found in northeastern India or across the country. But in specific to their question, it was more about jhum, as I understand it, was an indigenous practice that allowed for 30 years to pass before allowing regeneration of that area. And because of capitalist pressures, more cultivation is required. The time is a lot shorter. And like Brian said, unless that incentive to keep doing these destructive things is not lifted or supplemented, or there's no alternative to it, it's a need in the community that has to be addressed by the community, because nobody else is going to give that sort of support from the outside, because we live in that kind of globalized world, and that can be depressing, as Brian said. To the last question that just came up about good governance, it's, as I think we all agree, extremely crucial, because things like corruption or just bad management of resources, planning, external interests, they really do shape our lives on the everyday, how much food we have to access at the markets, how much, what water looks like for us on a day-to-day basis. It's fairly important. Good governance is part of that necessary. I think it was on your chart, Brian, at some point, about the role of that, if you want to close out talking about that.
Yeah, I think good governance and social connection is really important as we think about the welfare of humanity. And I think we have become reliant upon the very quick capitalistic gain. I think that we lose sight of the holistic approaches to ecosystem health and restoration, because we may have short-term gains, but we'll have long-term costs to ourselves and to our families and generations down the road, which we're seeing, which I think our young people are waking up to, but we hope to battle as fast as we possibly can. I think in general, the approach has been we privatize profits and then we socialize costs. With that becomes a real important part that governments must not think so linearly about just dollar. And this is idealistic. In general, I do think that some capitalist approach might benefit ecological restoration, but it's not all. I'm not anti-capitalist. I don't have any, there is a good and bad about every single system. But we are losing the gains that we are seeing through monetary growth. And I will say that, I truly am hopeful. It may sound like I am not very hopeful, and that's not true. We will see losses, and that just gets me up in the morning to fight even harder. But I will absolutely tell my students that if I wasn't hopeful, I would be probably working for one of these large capitalist organizations making as much money as I possibly can. I don't. I'm a teacher out of my ethical and moral compass, and my compass states lifting all and helping and educating and giving people the tools to better themselves and their communities, but to also integrate that into a land ethic and a sustainable metric. I think that's a nice closer, but I'm happy to keep going.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Brian and Lillian. We do have one more question from Matthews, but I'm going to call it and ask everyone to go home. And Matthews, I will send this question in an email to Lillian and Brian, and I'll copy you so that they can get back to you on that. For everybody, for those of you whose email addresses I do have, I will share the materials Brian and Mike were talking about. And Lillian, if you have things you'd like me to share, feel free to send them along. If I don't have your email and you know that, please put it in the chat and I'll happily include that. Or you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat right now. But thank you all so much for coming, and thanks especially to Brian and Lillian and Mike, even though he has already had to leave. I really enjoyed this and I learned a lot. And I'm really grateful for you all for taking the time to do this. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it as well. From Chicago, I'm here for you. So please reach out.
Yeah, thank you.
Take him up on that.
Have a good rest of your evenings, I guess, and Brian, rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, speakers and Brian.